this week's episode of Tell Me More. We're here in the studio on Monday morning, and we're talking about rebuilding, but how it intersects our life, our personal life, our corporate life. We even rant about social media at the end, and I think it's a good conversation. And so glad you're here, and enjoy the listen.
All right, well, it's podcast time. We're here. We're doing it.
I'm pumped.
I am too.
Yeah.
It's a good place to be. I look forward to this time.
Let's do it.
So we are still preaching through Ezra and Nehemiah.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a good series. We've been getting lots of great feedback. You mentioned as we came in, Dr. Wiles, that you wanted to talk more about how Ezra and Nehemiah aren't just this text that we mine for leadership principles or rebuilding principles, but it's actually part of the overarching promises of God.
Mm-hmm.
So the floor is yours.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Man, thank you.
All right, just take that wherever you want.
Yeah. I'm just glad he really didn't ask me about Auburn football. So we're doing well there. So
I'm not qualified to ask.
I did make a mention before we hit record of Texas Tech football.
Yes, and as you should.
Because they're winning.
Your husband's very happy.
Yes,
yeah.
And they won.
Unlike my Auburn Tigers.
I can almost promise you that I will never voluntarily bring up football in conversation.
Thank you, Luke.
Luke made some references to long distance running.
That's the more exciting stuff.
Marathons, which I have no affinity for.
However, Katie and I have a different definition of long distance running than does Luke.
Right. Mine would be like from here to the library, which is what, like 800 yards? And then I want a bottle of water and like a hot tub.
Bottle of water is nice.
Okay. Yeah,
promises of God.
We've talked about this a little bit.
Enough sports. Let's go.
Yeah, how the exile is a little undersold, probably in our biblical imagination. And I think at the heart, it's very different than the Exodus. If you think about, the Exodus, the children of Israel did nothing wrong that leads up to the story of the Exodus. It's not like it was the judgment of God.
Yeah, they're just bystanders.
They're just living and growing and multiplying. So there's no judgment from God that was prophesied.
They're actually fulfilling the mandate of Genesis.
Yes,
be fruitful and multiply.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So, but the deliverance from there is such a powerful story for them. Whereas the exile is very different. You get this prophetic word that God is going to judge them for their unfaithfulness and idolatry and their the pollution of their worship practices and the lack of knowledge of God. And so when you read the end of that story, in Jeremiah, it's a hard story, and I think they just trying to climb inside the minds of the Jews at that time. You're 500 and something years before Christ. I think many of them believed that God would protect them no matter what. Jerusalem's a holy city. There might be some judgment, but it's not really going to devastate that city, and certainly not the temple. And so for Nebuchadnezzar to come in and basically destroy all of that and burn the temple and tear the walls down and set things on fire. And I think that the devastation of that is probably hard for us to even wrap our minds around, because I don't know what we would compare it to in our setting. I don't think there is anything that if something was destroyed, we would be that devastated as Western Christians. But nevertheless, they were. And so for them to then all of a sudden come to grips with the fact that this is what God said was going to happen. And so they're now living in the reality of God's judgment. But God also spoke to them through men like Ezekiel to say, I'm going to scatter you, I'm going to judge you, but I am going to bring you back home. And when you come back home, you're going to come home pure and without idolatry, and you're going to be more faithful. And so the fact that when we're reading this story now and our point in history, well, that's exactly what happened. They did come back humbled. They're not a proud nation anymore. They don't have a king anymore. In fact, I guess you could argue they'll never have another king, except for the Messiah after this, So that whole, 500-year journey has ended. And so now they return, and they're still under the rule of a foreign government. So it's a much more humble group of people, if you will. And what's interesting is, when I mentioned this Sunday morning, when you look at the history of Israel after that, they don't participate in idolatry pretty much anymore after that. It's like that temptation ends.
Yeah, it's not something Jesus ever criticizes in the religious establishment or the life of the people.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. In fact, they were the very opposite.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They were so zealous.
Jesus is criticizing the pursuit of hyper-religious purity.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of fascinating that happened to them, but that is the truth. But that's what God said would happen. He said, you'll come home purer and you will come home. So the whole concept of God's promises being at play and how the world is somehow connected to that even these massive world powers are not able to thwart the promises of God. And so then, and not only that, God even uses them to help fulfill his promise, which is also quite fascinating. And I think that the reason I like to bring that up today is just for us to think about the fact that I think that for us today in the West, we are not as prone to associate God with the machinations of the real world anymore. It's interesting to me.
You're going to say more about that?
Yeah, I think that, so it's easy to read it back this way and go, oh my goodness, the Lord used Cyrus, the king of Persia, to set these people free. And he said he was going to do that, and he did it. We're loath.
Yeah, that made me kind of uncomfortable
to see the hand of God right now in anything, and it's unless it's an insurance company, like right now, there's a lot happening in the part of the U.S. And I was talking to some folks yesterday. I had not realized this weekend's been this whole week has been a crazy week for me. So just the massive amount of devastation there is.
You took the show on the road last week.
Yeah, I've been gone, and it's kind of been interesting. But I talked to my brother yesterday who lives in South Carolina, and then I've been texting with a good friend of mine, Will Dyer. Will's the pastor at First Baptist in Augusta, Georgia. Well, it's a massive amount of destruction. People out of power. There's like 1,000 people missing from this hurricane. But what's interesting is I also heard from a couple of friends of mine, one in particular who is opened a new business in Georgia, and he purchased this building and everything was okay, but then he spent all this money renovating the building, and now he's come to realize that his insurance doesn't cover a flood, and they told him that they referred to that as an act of God, and that he didn't cover that in his insurance policy, and so I thought it was an interesting phrase that's still used in the insurance parlance. It's an act of God.
It's like the last remaining nod.
That's right, the last thing to say that God can do, which is destructive, which is quite fascinating to me.
It's not a happy thing to see an act of God.
And it's said all over. It's used all over right now in that world because that's what they're calling it. Well, this is an act of God, and you didn't have flood insurance. So my point being,
I didn't have flood insurance when I lived on a mountain.
That's right. So,
Gosh, I know.
But I guess the point I'm making is we're loath to somehow see God's hand in anything like that, historically. Just like right now, as you might imagine, people who are interested in end of time prophecy. As y'all know, that's a certain segment of the Christian family. There are folk that that's always been the case. We've had that from the very beginning. And I would say of the Christian family, there have been people thinking they're living in the last generation. We have enough evidence of that in writing and in theology and discussion in church movements. As you might imagine, there's a huge revival of that right now because of what's happening in Israel. Israel is basically at war with all of its neighbors. I'm generalizing, but I think you get my drift. And that springs eschatology conversations into action. And what's fascinating about that is you usually have the ditch on both sides of the road there. You have some people who go all the way to the end with it, and they start interpreting everything that they can find that's happening right now as an indication that this is the end.
Yeah.
And then you have others who go all the way to the other extreme and say God is not involved in any of that. That's not what's going on. These are just human decisions. I guess my argument would be somewhere between those two extremes is reality. I don't mean just with Israel. I mean in general, that the hand of God is at work in this world, and trying to figure out how we interpret that and think about it and pray about it and reflect upon it theologically, I think is a worthy endeavor. And so when I look at this story, the Bible's pretty clear, though, in this text. He did this. He brought these people home. But then once they got home, they faced all kinds of challenges and still needed God's hand and God's direction and God's wisdom. You know, kind of like what you were saying, Katie, when you've been reading through it. You said it's been a while since you've read this text. And these guys are writing letters to the kings, you know, and then they're writing them
Kings
back.
writing back,
You know, and all of a sudden,
exhilarating.
You know, you've got these guys saying, hey, y'all can't be rebuilding this temple. I mean, Darius is not, nobody's giving you permission.
Like this text that you read out loud yesterday during the sermon, the text that the sermon was based on, it's like a fox couldn't even jump on this.
Yeah,
Is it fox? Is that what it was?
Right, yeah. Fox gets on the wall.
It's just very, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
this
an
wall's
engaging
terrible.
amount of material.
Can't even hold up a fox.
Yeah.
What heckling? What Old Testament heckling, you know?
And I'm glad that's in there, you know. And of course, we've uncovered the wall that Nehemiah built. And it's like 9 feet wide or 9 feet thick. I mean, I think it could handle a fox. But
compared to the old wall,
whatever.
Yeah,
that's it. They're wondering, and plus they're even questioning whether these people know how to do it. I think that's really the accusation.
And we talked about that in here.
Yeah.
Like, because you're not left with the working men, like the craftsmen.
That's right.
You're left with kind of unskilled labor, and
and now you think you're going to build the
it's like if me and Luke tried to go build a wall.
Well, you think about it, not just that. The most intricate part of the building, you know, you've got to build all these gates. Well, these gates were challenging to construct because they had to match up to the wall and they had to be a certain size. They had to work. So you're having to bring some skilled people into this conversation. Right. You know,
I built the gate.
Can even be done.
I built the gate once. It is harder than it looks.
Yeah.
I don't want to do it again.
Yeah, even in your backyard.
Yeah.
You kind of build a fence. It's all good. You get to the gate and you're like,
Yeah.
this thing has to open and close.
Yes. And many of the listeners that I'm envisioning have done this and can do it quite well. Yeah. But it was hard to do.
Sure. So
fence is no big deal.
Right.
Just a line. This is a line that has to move.
So just imagine. And so in this story, though, they keep tracing the hand of God. Yeah. Just over and over. We stopped and prayed. Sanballat comes in and says, okay, we don't want Jerusalem being restored. We don't want all these Jews moving back into the city because we know there is power there. I think that's what they were saying. We know this city in the past has been the seat of power in this whole part of the world. Well, the last thing we want is for it to be fortified again and have all these Jews moving back into the city and actually having this spiritual revival. So we're going to stop it. And Nehemiah says, so we prayed. In other words, here he is dealing with I guess you'd consider Nehemiah at this point in his time kind of like the governor or the mayor, if you will, pick a term that we would identify with. He's a political leader right now, if you would see him that way. Ezra is a theological leader, so he's a biblical scholar. Nehemiah is more in the political, or that's what he was really doing in Persia. He was a cupbearer, but we know that means he was more of someone who was working in the palace.
Kind of in the cabinet.
Yeah,
something.
So he's not a theologian, so to speak, if you will, a trained theologian. Yeah, and but at every turn, he'll just stop and pray. And sometimes he'll even record the prayer for you, in his journal. And so he had no doubt that God's hand was somehow woven into the journey. We heard a little bit of that testimony, Katie, at our prayer breakfast on Saturday when our former mayor was talking about
It was
issues.
a good prayer breakfast. You said that yesterday,
powerful,
but
I thought.
I know. Anyway, and we'll talk about that at some point. I don't want to derail.
Yeah.
But thinking about it.
Right, but I just remember those days when I was much more closely connected to the things going on in our city because my best friend here basically was the mayor.
Yeah.
And I cannot tell you how many prayer times we had of just call me at, late at night and this meeting is about to happen and we just need to pray, or could you just come up here and pray? And I did that all the time. And it's the kind of thing, to be honest with y'all, I didn't really think about.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a pastor. I live in this town.
Yeah, this is your friend.
One of our church members is the mayor. I mean, my goodness, of course. And so I did it all the time.
Yeah.
And he looks back at that story and can chart how he believes that prayer had an impact
and he did
at various places.
On Saturday.
Yeah,
and it was
very powerful.
Very impactful, yeah.
So all I'm saying is when I'm reading this story, I want to make sure our people, somehow I want to connect that. I don't think I've done a good enough job yet with everybody to help them get connected to that part of the story.
To which part?
Just that we're praying as we're living, and we're actually connecting what God might be doing through us and in us in our everyday normal lives as we're building a company or as we're making decisions that are having an impact upon our community. Not just individually praying, but actually praying for God's hand to be around us, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
They did that as a matter of course,
So as people living in the world that we find ourselves in, I think, there are these two ditches that you've referenced. And so the one is, there's nothing at play here. This is just the chain of events. It is what it is. And this would be like if Nehemiah was written. And then these political people opposed us and we said no. And then we kept going. And then this, so just there's nothing spiritual happening. The other side of that ditch is you look down and you go, oh, my coffee grounds are arranged in my cup in this way. Right. God must be doing this.
Right. God is speaking. Yeah.
So how,
everything's a sign.
How do we find the, and that's a very innocuous example probably, but you find.
That was the goal.
Okay,
that was the goal.
That was the goal.
I think it makes a point.
But how do we find that middle way?
Yeah.
Which is, such a First Baptist Arlington thing to do, is to try and find the middle way.
The center.
Between two ditches.
Yeah, but one that, because I will confess, then I think some of the listeners can identify with me, and others could probably identify with the other side, but maybe, I don't think, I'm not saying either of us are on the ditch, but maybe I'm on one side of the road.
You lean toward one direction
where,
or the other.
where I do have trouble ascribing things unequivocally to like the hand of God,
right.
You know, especially, or the hand of the devil.
Right.
Because
I mean, the New Testament's clear that there are powers and principalities at work, and some of those are human, and some of those are not human.
I actually think it's probably the harder for me to like walk outside, see a flat, and be like spiritual warfare, because I think we've overdone it. I think that's why. But I also think like, and Ashley can speak to this because she, I think, does experience some of that in a level in her life and can see it and acknowledge it with a mature lens. So I don't want to. I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying it's just a confession that I am more doubt-filled in those moments to credit really either. And if I'm not careful, I'll live a very secular life. You know, I'll just blinders that God's not really at work. Where others that may be listening or maybe not are on the other side of the road, not the ditch, where just easily credit their activity in their life to God's hand or maybe some spiritual forces or whatever you'd call that.
Yeah, and I think that's an honest.
But how do we stay in the middle?
Struggle,
is Luke's question.
If you want to call it that.
Yeah.
I have typically found that heresy tends to live on the extremes, in general, historically. Orthodoxy is normally found somewhere in the balance. At least that would be my take on things often. That doesn't mean you can't be passionate and radical sometimes, but I think I probably live in somewhere in the middle that leans a little more the opposite direction of what you just described, Katie. I lean a little more toward watching things happening, and one of my first questions is this God? Is this the force of evil? Is this an attack from Satan? Is this a blessing from God? Is this a direction from God? And I'm not saying that you don't do that as well. What I mean is, I just confess that you're not hurting my feelings. I lean that way myself.
Yeah.
But
I'm psychoanalyzing us.
Yeah.
I don't need to go there. Is that our natural proclivity? Am I just born kind of a skeptic? You know what I mean?
Sure.
Or is it just
I get it.
I roll my eyes
it's been overdone. When I was in seminary,
maybe that's it. It's just, is it nature versus nurture? But that's not what I'm trying to make this podcast about. But I'm like, because you're a very trusting and hopeful person, and I love that in our pastor. I want that in our pastorate. And so is that just, anyway, do we get out of bed just thinking that every day? That's my question, and I don't need to explore it anymore, but I needed to say it out loud.
And my answer is yes. But I know when I was in seminary one time, one of my professors, Dr. Macbeth, he's a history professor. And so we were in the PhD program. One of the challenges that he placed in front of us was to develop our own philosophy of history. And it felt like that was very important for someone, and particularly who's pursuing a PhD in history. Mine was Christian history, but still, the thing is, you have a certain viewpoint. And it's funny because once I got into the study of history more deeply, I think people have naive views about historians. Because I think sometimes people look at historians who are classic historians who do this for a living, that they just chronicle events, and that's kind of what historians have always done. Well, nothing could be further from the case. The historians never just chronicle events. That's really not what happens. They write history from a certain perspective with a philosophy underneath it. They all do.
They can't help it.
They can't help it.
They can't take that hat off.
In fact, it's one of the reasons it makes history interesting and useful, I believe. And so that was a challenge for me because I'd never given it a whole lot of thought. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life at that time. We were still interviewing with the Foreign Mission Board, now called the International Mission Board, assuming that we would live overseas, and I would probably be teaching at some level in a theological education environment and teaching history and providing that overview. And so I had never really given it a whole lot of thought about my own philosophy of history. And so where I've landed is I'm in the camp of what I would call the providential view of history, that history is purposeful and meaningful, and that God is shepherding history toward a desired end. And so if that's the cover, if you will, or even the foundation, depending on your analogy, everything as I view history, I view it in that regard. And I would say, kind of to answer to your question, Luke, probably for me, I tend to interpret things being of God or not of God in retrospect more often than while I'm in the moment of it.
I think there's a lot of spiritual wisdom there.
Yeah, that's usually what happens to me. It takes me a while and I look back on it.
Hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah, I look back on it and go, I think that right there must have been the hand of God, because I see now when I'm in the moment, I'm loath to name it. Because, when you read the scripture, first of all, I would say the core answer to all of our questions is to stay tied to the text. How did the people of God do this in the past? And when were they their best? And what do we learn from what they see? Like when Peter says, you're going to encounter fiery trials. It's just going to happen. James says, count it joy, when you're experiencing this. So sometimes the trouble comes and it's from the hand of God. It's a time of testing. We don't like to think of it that way. We were kind of joking earlier about how, insurance companies call this an act of God. Well, there are some times in our lives when these are acts of God. God is testing us, our faith. Other times, it's obviously something God's allowing, but not necessarily He's providing the instrumentation of it. Typically, what I would say to that is regardless of whether it's from God or not from God, it's a time of testing and a trial. I got to find my way through it. Usually, in retrospect, I'll make a judgment on whether or not I think it was from the Lord or not. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. So,
and I think from my camp, not that we're in different camps, we are in the same camp.
Yeah, we are.
My side of the camp, whatever. I have a pretty strong belief that God uses all things, like that Romans 8. Like I just believe that. Yeah. And so even if I can't ascribe who's behind it or what's going on or did this thing just happen? I've got a pretty strong resolve within me that whatever it is, whether I got myself into it, God brought it upon me, Satan brought it upon me, whatever, that God's going to use this for my good and His glory.
And that's
even if I get stuck,
even
if I get stuck on the origin of it.
Right. I think that's a great.
I'm pretty resolved to the purpose that God can use in it, even if it looks really bad in the moment.
Well, I think a good example.
And I may be getting us afield, and I'm sorry if I am.
It's okay.
But I think our listeners, I think it's relevant. Or I wouldn't be talking about it.
Because Ezra and Nehemiah.
It's not relevant. Don't tell us about it.
Yeah, whatever. Fast forward. Just fast forward. It's my podcast. Let's go.
But these guys are both writing from the perspective of here's what God did.
Yeah.
That they are. That's their take on things. But I remember years ago, a hurricane, or it might have been a tornado, I can't remember, was headed toward Virginia, and Pat Robertson was on television back in those days, and he made this huge appeal and asked people to pray for that, whichever one it was, to turn and not hit the part of Virginia where they were located. And that happened. At the last minute, this, I don't remember, tornado, hurricane, whatever, turned and landed in another spot in the U.S. And well, Pat Robertson's take on that was the people of God prayed, we came together, and the Lord moved this into a different direction. Now, the cynical people said, oh, well, that's awesome for the people that got hit. Great. You just, you prayed it away from you and it harmed others. And Pat Robertson's response to that was, well, had we all been praying, this thing might have turned around and gone back out in the ocean for all we know. But we know for a fact we were praying. But what was fascinating to me about it is I listened to that. There were a lot of Christian pastors who used that on Sunday mornings because we heard about it because there were people talking about it in the news who said, Pat Robertson is crazy. God does not, I'm talking about pastors are saying, God does not send a hurricane here and then move it and send it over there just, almost out of spite, so to speak. Well, then that led to the question, so y'all don't believe that God is involved in anything. So what are you praying about anyway? If you see what I'm saying. In other words, it was like, okay, maybe I'm not a Pat Robertson fan, but okay, he was displaying a worldview, if you will, publicly that was criticized. And I get it. It's one of those things. It's hard to know, and I don't claim to know. So I was going to say, Dr. Macbeth years ago, when he was teaching us and challenging us to form our philosophy of history, he said that here's what I think God's going to do one day. We're going to be in the middle of something, and all these folks are going to see there's the hand of God, and God's going to just rip the heavens open and go, no, I did not do that, I didn't do that, and I didn't do that. He said, because so many people are so quick to just throw this up that God did this, God did this. So somewhere there is a balance in there,
right.
And I try to find it. I lean toward, because of my providential view of history and my understanding of how that sovereignty of God works, I'm more Wesleyan than Calvin in my view of all that. I'm not a Calvinist, and I'm comfortable in that. But I do believe that God is at work in our world. I believe He's at work right now. I think that things are taking place that are preparing this world for the return of Jesus. I don't know what they all are, but I will say this. In my lifetime, the world conversations have become much more religious than we would have ever believed they would have been when I was much younger. There was not a whole lot of conversation about religions, if you will, when I was y'all's age studying in seminary. We didn't talk much about Islam. Maybe that was on us, but I'm just telling you, it had no political force almost, if you know what I mean. Those kinds of conversations didn't take place. You didn't have to know about it because it was just something missionaries encountered. Well, look at where we are today. Today we live in a constant religious conversation. Well, that piques my interest a little bit. That makes me wonder, I wonder if God is orchestrating something that all of a sudden people are realizing how important religion really is, that it actually influences your everyday life. And there are people that make these massive decisions, governments, based upon their religious convictions, and it shows that it's not just a private kind of thing. It actually has public ramifications. Well, sure, I've reflected on that more than just running roughshod and going, that's the end of the world, y'all. We need to,
batten down the hatches.
It's over. I'm not saying that, but I am saying I've got a couple of raised eyebrows right now, just over my span of reflecting on it theologically. That's fascinating to me, because I can remember a time when this was never talked about, and now it seems to be a part of our everyday conversation. And so that's fascinating to me. So I guess I'm just saying, when we're studying all this, I love the lessons that I believe we're walking through. I do. I'm doing them, and
we hope you love them.
I did it on purpose, because I feel like that churches like ours and many others are having to think through, what are we going to do in response to what's happening to our society? Pick something: de-churching, pluralism, secularism, pessimism, loneliness. Just pick, go sociologically, go theologically, go politically, pick an arena. And I believe churches right now are having to reevaluate what they're actually doing and how are we addressing what's taking place in our society. And we're doing that very same thing. Our church has been here a long time, but behind the scenes, we're putting some teams together to evaluate, how do we make some of these decisions, and what do we do with all that the Lord has given to us, and how are we best organized, and what is the Lord saying to us right now at this point in the history of our church about our community and the issues that we're facing here. And also, what are our missional responsibilities? Where does the Lord want us to go to share this good news, and how do we do that effectively as a church? I hope my church members would be encouraged by that, to know we're not just on autopilot here, because the world is too broken for that. We've got to be more thoughtful, in my opinion. And so this whole idea of rebuilding, that's why I wanted to have this conversation at this point in the year, because I just felt like, okay, I want to put in front of the church, it's not just individuals rebuilding their lives. I want to minister to our people and encourage them in that. But there is a lot of rebuilding that's taking place right now, and I think it's
I'm getting a lot of questions
important
about
conversation.
that. I'm sure you are too.
Oh, of course.
Because people can hear it with a lens of, is he dropping hints about something big that's about to roll out?
And what I would say is, it's not that necessarily. I don't have some hidden secret about it. I'm just wanting to plow the ground a little bit to let people know there are conversations happening, because they should happen. How should we be engaging in ministry at this point in the history of our church and in our community? And our community has changed so much. And some of our people haven't even understood that yet, I believe. the radical difference that we're in terms of our ministry context that we're facing right now.
Because their life hasn't necessarily
That's
changed.
right. Sure.
But the world around them,
Absolutely.
just outside that
Yes.
life of theirs,
And
is
just y'all's intersection.
Luke, obviously your
has-
area of passion and research is this.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say your intersection, just like for when Jeff shared at the a prayer breakfast Saturday morning, when he became mayor, we were like I forgot what he said,
11 maybe?
11th
Yeah,
most diverse city in America. Now we're like number 5 or something. I forgot what
it's
he
crazy
said.
high.
Yeah.
And so
in
all of a
America.
sudden-
I mean, think about that.
In the entire country. And we're just in,
Oh, and we're surrounded by the 4th most diverse university
Yeah.
in the country.
Yeah.
So
In the country. We're not talking about Texas.
in
I mean,
America.
the whole country.
And it's like, oh, okay, you know what? We're in a very different cultural setting
Yeah.
than even when I came here, y'all.
And I think even I mean, to be transparent, my little routes and bubbles and where I drop my kids off maybe doesn't tell me that full story.
Right.
And it's not until you get in the public school system or city leadership where you realize just how very diverse.
Very
You only have to go to
it is.
Costco.
Yeah.
Just go to Costco.
Yeah.
You'll see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I don't
to a
to
high school
I don't go to
football game.
Costco.
I went to one Friday night.
I wish I could. I mean, I'll get there.
It's a very
Let's go get lunch
diverse.
at Costco.
It's a very
would love
diverse crowd at the.
Okay, first
high
I want to
school
talk
football
about
game.
what Dr. Wiles was talking about. When you go
Yes.
to a high school football game in Texas, no, excuse me, when you go to an Arlington high school football
you go.
game, the crowd is completely diverse.
Very
Does that include, I mean, the cheer squad,
Yeah,
the,
everybody.
the
Everything.
student athletes,
Everybody.
everybody.
homecoming court.
And that is how many miles from right here?
Exactly. So that's
Very,
what I
very
mean.
few.
Yeah.
But the second thing that I want us to make sure we talk about is Luke invited me to lunch at the Costco food court, and I'm pumped. And
Let's roll.
it will happen, and I will report back. Thank you very much.
I did not know.
Kitty's going to love that $1.50 hot dog.
I can't wait. There's pizza too, right? Yeah, I love
I've
it.
never
I
had
don't have a
lunch.
Costco
I've only
membership.
been to Costco 2 times in my entire life.
D-Dub, do you want in on this?
I have no idea. 'Cause I don't know what it is.
Hot dog on me.
There's some kind of ice cream confection too, right?
Sure. We're getting too far afield.
No such thing. Okay, no, back to it. Yeah, so
But-
we live in a very
or
diverse context.
The dollar
do.
steak night that our college ministry sponsored.
Yeah.
Incredibly diverse. So my point being,
Yeah.
okay, so here we are, been here a long time. We have a lot of great ministries, and we're grateful to God for them. We believe the Lord has led us to them. The question is, okay, now as we look into the future, what is the Lord saying to us about the future? I don't know yet, but I'm not afraid of it. And just like that's why if you're going to rebuild something, well, here are some great lessons. That's what I'm wanting to put in front of our people. If you're rebuilding your own personal life, I think you can learn some valuable lessons here in this story because that's what this story is all about. And so I will stand by these lessons where I watch Nehemiah and Ezra record prayers and you're trying to really ask God for his wisdom. They both, in Zerubbabel as well as Nehemiah, did an honest assessment. Okay, where are we? Zerubbabel and Joshua had to look at the old temple. Okay, can we rebuild the temple like it was? I don't think so. Not even sure we need it to be that way.
but
God's given
what
us
can
enough
we do?
instruction.
Yeah.
Let's just lay the foundation. Let's just get an altar first and draw the people to worship, and then we'll start building. Well, same thing happened with Nehemiah. He looks at where the wall used to be, and he says, we're not going to be able to do that. The rubble has destroyed this part of the city. We've got to move the wall in a little bit. And so, they reevaluated, and that's what they did. So they took an honest assessment to put a plan together, and then lo and behold, they start getting opposition. Well, that's just what happens,
Yeah.
And next Sunday, we're going to talk about distractions. One of the things that happens to you when in the throes of it all, you can kind of lose your focus, and it's not really opposition. It's just losing your energy, and you get distracted with other things, and the rebuilding process doesn't feel to be so important all of a sudden, and that can just happen to you. Well, that's when you've got to reinfuse it with energy and thought. If you're going to bring this thing to somehow bring it to completion in your life or in the life of a business or a church. And so I love that all that's right there in front of us in Ezra and Nehemiah.
So what I hear is that you're preaching it from a rebuilding perspective, but for you still have your leadership hat on.
I do.
Because you talked about that's an angle from which you
It
could
is.
preach it. But as I hear you talking here, maybe you're still our shepherd and you're looking at it, but from an institutional leadership perspective as well.
It's both. You know, I've gone through seasons in my life where I have felt like I've had to rebuild because of things that have just changed. But I've also led that as a pastor.
Right, a professional life as well.
I have.
If we call that, if we call it's not a profession.
Yeah.
I mean, it's more than that for us, but no.
Still,
Yeah.
it is. And I would say that's okay. These same lessons are applicable, and I'm learning and praying as I'm going through it all. I mean, when I go walking in the morning, these are the things I'm praying about as I pray for our people, obviously. But I'm thinking about this kind of thing. I'm thinking, and not only that, as I'm going various places and speaking right now, this is what pastors are talking about. It's what they're coming up to me to talk about. You know, I spent the day in Hardin-Simmons this past week and talked about planning after preaching. And what does that look like? And basically, the title of my seminar was Pastoring Your Church from the Pulpit. And we talked together about how do you give God a chance to use the pulpit to help shape your people and pastor them through whatever it is that they might be facing or whatever the church may be facing. And so we
and you use this as an example.
Yes.
Right? Because it's going so well, and you're in the middle of it. I can't imagine you didn't bring it up.
Well, I did.
I mean, I would have.
Yeah, but we talked about the big picture of how we got to this whole journey to begin with. Why are we focusing on together? How did I get to that? Well, if you back up, there are numerous reasons how we even arrived at this theme, if you will, that has given us something else to build around. Same thing is true for where we're headed. You know, we're headed toward a conversation that's at least going to be 3 years, probably a little longer, about flourishing. What does it mean to flourish as people, as a community,
Save
as a
the
church?
Date, January 24, 25, 26, here at the church.
We're going to launch with a retreat. And we're going
what is this flourishing thing, and how does it impact our life?
Exactly. And so I just talked to these pastors about how did I get to all of that? How does that happen in the life of a pastor to where now you're actually pastoring your church from the pulpit? And so, there's a strategy to it all, you know, and I believe it's of God. And so, but when you're doing something like that, I just want to make sure as we're studying Ezra and Nehemiah, looking for these principles, we're also acknowledging the fact that this is a real story that happened in real time. And at the heart of it, it was God fulfilling his promises and bringing these people back together. And it so contextualizes the New Testament. And that's why I wanted to point that out Sunday morning. This temple, they did it, and Jesus is going to actually walk in it. And this wall, they built it. Jesus is going to go through these very gates. So it kind of brings the New Testament alive, that this is the New Testament world being prepared by these very people. So that pivotal time in history that's changed everything for us was being prepared for during this particular
Literally
era.
laying the groundwork.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so undersold. When, like you said, when's the last time people read Ezra and Nehemiah? When Ezra and Nehemiah are so pivotal to what's going to happen in the New Testament. Even the theology, some of the questions about the Samaritans and some of the antagonism that they're going to face, and then the bristling on their neck, you know, of these foreign powers, Persians, whoever they are. So the next thing you know, the Maccabees are going to rise up and say, we just need to rule ourselves. We don't need these foreign powers to undergird us. But it just so happens once that's happening and they're starting to assert their independence, if you will, well, there's a whole nother empire looming that they had no clue, you know. I mean, obviously the Greeks, but eventually the Romans. And they didn't know all that was happening, but that's exactly what occurs. And so that gets woven into the fabric of the New Testament story. So this is just a pivotal time in history, but it's rich depending on your perspective, what you're looking for, you know. So that's why I really love it. I've been teased by a couple of long-time church members saying, you know, you've been here a long time, and I remember one time you did a leadership thing from Nehemiah. I don't ever remember even mentioning Nehemiah much, you know, in all these years. Well, that's on me, you know. I said, well, I get it. It's got one of my favorite stories we're going to get to because I'm a joyful person, and we're going to get to this story about joy, you know, in Nehemiah, which is very powerful and resilience. And so there's still a lot left here, you know, before we wind this thing up at the end of October. So, and I'm looking forward to it.
Don't check out. This is really good content.
Let's keep rebuilding.
If I may, in the last 5 minutes, even though that felt like we could have just landed the plane there, for a few weeks now, you kind of danced around a topic, and then yesterday, because this is Monday when we're recording, you said you had a whole sermon about it. Do you want to tease?
Once you settle down, isn't that kind of what it was?
Yeah.
Do you want to tease your thoughts on
this is Tell Me More.
social media?
So you can't say that from the pulpit and not expect a question at Tell Me More.
Is a podcast considered social media?
It's I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Because it's one way. It's dynamic. It's static, not dynamic.
Okay.
That'd be my.
Right.
So a YouTube channel might be.
Because it's got comments.
Yeah, comments. So,
Okay.
but it's
All right.
the kind of two-way dynamic.
That's kind of what I was
Yeah.
thinking. Yeah. Well,
So no, you're safe here. You're safe.
I just know that we're in a season. Obviously, it's heightened political season, but also just the what's happening across the world, and people are just very prone to use social media as an instrument to malign and speak ill of others and minimize others and draw caricatures of people with issues that are way more complex than something you can manage in a 4-sentence Facebook post or on X or TikTok, whatever it is that people use, and think that they're going to convince the whole world of their opinion. And the way they oftentimes choose to convince others is by maligning the opinions of those that they're disagreeing with, rather than engaging in real dialogue where you actually honor what someone else believes and tries to hear the good of maybe what's there that you could actually learn from yourself. The social media is built on just it's almost like vengeful kind of behavior, and it feeds the worst part of us, in my opinion. And it's not as we were talking earlier today before we got on the podcast, these algorithms, it's not objective and pure in what's brought to you.
It's not trying to make you content.
In case you're
and happy.
not aware,
Because then you'd log off and go
social
back to the real
media
world.
across every platform is shaped by an algorithm that's essentially designed.
What's an algorithm?
It would. I'm not a computers person, so
either.
bear with me if you are. But essentially, think of it like it's code. Code would be the language that computers speak. But an algorithm is basically a set of parameters that are trying to figure out what you spend the most time looking at. So like, if you aren't aware of this is just something to know. When you look at a post, it's tracking how long you look at it.
Yeah, even if you don't interact with it.
It's
You
just
could
tracking how
hover
long
over it
you
for a
look.
long time.
If you comment on it, if you like it, and then it's kind of measuring that against, well, they spent more time looking at this, less time looking at this. Social media is a business. It wants money. It's making money off of your attention. So its entire premise is to get you to look at more stuff longer.
Just consume more media.
And so if you look at one side of the political spectrum and you engage with it and you look at it more, it's going to keep showing you more and more, but it's also going to show you escalating more and more. So it's going to get more and more entrenched in a viewpoint. And in the process, you end up actually, just by the way the algorithm's designed, trapped in one perspective, and it's going to keep showing you and feeding you that one perspective.
Yeah.
And it's because it's making money on your attention.
Exactly right. It's crazy.
It's not neutral.
So, which is why I get so many videos about chipping around the green, and how to hit the high chip.
Because you pay
And
attention.
I was going to say, I'm trying to get out of sand traps and save my golf score. So
You're like, let me rewatch that.
I have
Let me
so
rewatch
much
that.
advice.
Let me
from
rewatch
my
that.
golfers. If you look at my feed, that's what I get.
Well, it's a good reminder from Luke said this before in here, but we're all being formed spiritually. So you don't get the option, just because you don't wake up and read your Bible every day doesn't mean you're not being formed. There are forces, whatever you want to call it, that are forming us spiritually, and you just have to be on the watch. And I've talked about this before from the pulpit, like the modern day spiritual warfare. It's using the means that get us, and so just be thoughtful. Here I am talking about spiritual warfare. And I said it on
I have a feeling
I'm
Paul
so
would call
proud
the
of you.
algorithms
but-
a principality and power.
Yeah.
But
I'm
I
proud
do
of
because
you,
I think,
Katy.
well,
Good
and I
job.
think, someone, and again, I'm just taking things afield, but if you think, like, close your eyes and think about what you think about spiritual warfare, it's like if it's angels with swords in their hand, swords were the weapon of the day.
That's right.
And then so if you think about what is the weapon of today, it might be, if you think about what is being weaponized literally in warfare right now,
Exactly.
it is things like bots and it's the internet. And so be careful out there because it's not an innocent ground.
That's right.
And you do need to be aware of how you're being manipulated, not just by Fox News, if you're watching too much news, CNN, Facebook, but also just ads. And, it can eat your spirit alive if we're not careful.
Right. And that's why I think at some point there's a sermon there about how to engage it, because we're going to engage it. Most people are.
Yeah.
But
Because we're not
Yeah,
We're
we're not
not
going
desert
to
monks.
remove ourselves
Yeah.
from it, you know.
Isolationists,
We're
whatever.
not. We're not Benedictine monks,
Yeah.
okay?
Who
But
actually
all due
famously had one of the earliest websites.
That's
Did
right.
you know that?
Yeah, all due respect.
They didn't know. They couldn't have known.
But so I just think that there's a way to approach everything, no matter what it is, from a mature Christian perspective. I guess that's what I would argue for. I've rarely had my opinion swayed by a mic drop moment on social media. Mm-hmm. Now, I said to y'all earlier, now if I'm living in an oppressive country and, you know, it's the only means, it's the only way to get a message out of hope and freedom, well, that's a little different. I don't live in that setting. Yeah. You know, I live in the freedom of America and in the bounty, if you will. And so I often find it humorous, you know. And then I even have to check my spirit on that, because sometimes it's really not humorous. It's almost sad to think this is what's consuming you, and this is what's spilling out, and this is where your fear and your anger just spills over. It's fascinating. And so I would encourage
you may be telling your pastor more about yourself than you
exactly.
thought you were in that moment.
I learned a long time ago, one of my professors at seminary, Dr. Gray, used to tell us, whatever you're full of, when you get bumped, that's what spills out. Yeah. And he used the analogy of a waiter or a waitress walking through a busy restaurant holding a tray over their head, and you don't know what it is, and somebody bumps them, and all of a sudden
you know what it is.
All of a sudden there it all is.
Yeah.
That to me is kind of what I see happening. I'm like, ooh, I had no idea you were that angry. My goodness, you know. Yeah. I mean, because here it is. So I just think that, particularly right now, you know, there's enough of that already. I'm not going to contribute to it.
Okay. Well, if you would like this sermon series, here's my contender. I know you're not a topical preacher, but here we go.
It's a serious preacher, though. Yeah.
I've got 3. We may have to come up with a 4th because we don't have very many 3 Sunday months. But it's like, comment, share. Following the Jesus Way online.
Like, comment, share.
You got a sermon on liking,
what?
commenting,
I like
and sharing.
Subscribe.
Wow.
Oh, like, comment, share, subscribe.
Whoa.
There we go.
Whoa.
So if you want that to be the sermon series,
Our Gen Z videographer is nodding. We got something right.
make sure you let Dr. Wiles know on Sunday morning.
Perfect.
Yeah. Coming.
There you
Spring
have it.
2025. Not really. Not really. You did not hear it here. Okay.
I'm mostly joking.
But
I wouldn't hate it.
Well, he's out in July, so we can do whatever.
Yeah, I was about to say.
But
Y'all can take this thing over.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back next week.
Appreciate y'all. Thanks for listening to the Tell Me More podcast today. You can subscribe to this podcast on your app of choice, or you can visit us at fbca.org to find out more information about the podcast and our church. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.